The metal shovel struck something solid. The sound echoed differently this time. It wasn't rock or tree root. It was hollow, artificial, built by human hands. Robert Caldwell stopped digging and wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of his muddy hand. On that cold November morning, while trying to install a new septic system on his newly acquired property, he never imagined he was about to unearth a secret that would change his life forever. What he found 10 feet below the soil of his humble Montana mountain cabin wasn't just concrete. It was a reinforced steel door with military numbers still visible through the rust and time. Robert's heart raced. He'd bought this isolated property just 6 months ago for only $17,500, an absurdly low price for 40 acres of land and a functional cabin. The neighbors had looked at him strangely when he moved in. The real estate agent had been excessively pushy about closing the deal quickly. Now, kneeling in the cold mud and staring at that buried structure, all those red flags finally made sense. Something was hidden down there, something that someone had worked very hard to keep secret for decades. Robert's hands trembled as he cleared more dirt from the metal surface. Numbers and letters appeared engraved in the corroded steel. CB 7, 1962, classified. 1962, Cold War. Robert's mind started connecting the dots at alarming speed. This was the era of nuclear bunkers, hidden missile silos, secret military installations scattered throughout the American heartland. But why here? Why on his property? And most importantly, why hadn't anyone mentioned this during the sale? The silence of the surrounding forest seemed to grow even denser as he contemplated the possibilities. He pulled his cell phone from his pocket with dirt-covered fingers. No signal. Of course, there was no signal out here in the middle of nowhere. That's exactly why he'd chosen this place, to escape the city, the noise, the people. But now that isolation felt sinister. Robert looked back at the cabin behind him, then back to the hole he'd dug. The concrete structure extended in both directions, disappearing under the earth. This wasn't just a small cellar or a domestic shelter. It was something much larger, something professional, something military. Before we reveal what was hidden beneath Robert's cabin, tell us in the comments, where are you watching from today? Are you in a quiet rural area like Robert's property, or somewhere completely different? We'd love to hear from you as we continue this incredible story. The discovery raised urgent questions. If there was a military bunker buried on his property, was he technically the legal owner? Or did the government still maintain rights over classified structures like this? Robert remembered stories he'd heard about people who found archaeological treasures or historical artifacts and lost everything to the state. But this was different. He had the deed to the land. He'd paid with his own sweat and savings. $17,500 represented everything he'd saved working as a diesel mechanic for the past 5 years. The sun began setting behind the giant pine trees surrounding the property. Robert knew he needed to make a decision. He could cover everything back up and pretend he'd never found anything. He could call the authorities and probably lose any control over the situation. Or he could investigate on his own, discover what was down there before deciding his next steps. Curiosity won over fear. He grabbed the shovel again and started digging around the steel door, revealing more of the buried structure. The more he dug, the more impressive the construction became. The concrete was at least 12 inches thick, reinforced with steel bars that still looked solid despite the decades underground. The door was at least 6 feet tall and 3 feet wide, with industrial hinges the size of human fists. There was a complex locking mechanism on the side, oxidized but still intact. Robert calculated mentally. A door like this should easily weigh 500 to 600 pounds. It wasn't built to keep animals out. Night fell completely, and Robert was forced to stop. He covered the excavation with a waterproof tarp and some branches, more to disguise than to protect. He walked back to the cabin with clothes soaked in sweat despite the cold. Inside the small wooden structure he now called home, he lit the wood stove and made strong coffee. His hands still trembled, but now it was from excitement more than fear. He pulled out his old laptop and opened the digitized files of the property documentation he'd received at closing. Reviewing the documents under new light, Robert began noticing strange details he'd ignored before. The property had changed hands 7 times in the past 30 years, always for low prices, always with quick sales. It had never stayed with the same family for more than 5 years. Previous owners had names that were too common: John Smith, David Johnson, Robert Williams. They were names that seemed fake, placed there just to maintain a legal chain of ownership. And, strangest of all previous sales had been facilitated by the same real estate company, a small firm in Helena that he couldn't find any current records for online. Robert Caldwell was no stranger to good opportunities. During his 38 years of life, he'd learned that usually the best deals came with some kind of compromise or hidden flaw. But when the Montana property listing appeared in his online search 6 months ago, it seemed too good to be true. 40 acres of untouched forest, a fully functional log cabin, a creek running along the southern edge of the property, and all of it for $17,500. The price was less than half the market value for similar land in the region. The first time Robert visited the property was in May. The real estate agent, a nervous man named Martin Hayes, met him on the main road and guided him through the last 6 miles of dirt road to the site. Throughout the entire journey, Hayes maintained an incessant conversation about how this was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, how the seller was motivated to close quickly, and how Robert would be crazy to let this chance pass. The pressure was palpable, almost desperate. Hayes sweated profusely despite the mild spring temperature, and his eyes constantly darted away while he spoke. The property itself seemed ordinary at first glance. The log cabin had probably been built in the 70s, with a metal roof still in good condition and double-pane windows that kept the heat in. The interior was Spartan but functional: a main room with a stone fireplace, a small kitchen with a wood stove and propane refrigerator, 2 tiny bedrooms, and a bathroom with a cast-iron tub. There were no luxuries, but for someone seeking a simple, isolated life, it was perfect. The surrounding land was covered with massive ponderosa pines and Douglas firs, with occasional clearings where deer grazed on foggy mornings. Hayes insisted the deal needed to close in less than 2 weeks. The seller, he explained, was moving abroad for personal reasons and wanted to liquidate his American assets quickly. When Robert asked about structural inspections or soil tests, Hayes waved his hand, saying the seller was selling as is and offering an additional $1,000 discount if Robert waived inspections. In retrospect, it was an obvious red flag. But at that time, Robert was so tired of urban life, the constant noise, the invasive neighbors, that he ignored his instincts. The closing was even stranger. It happened at a law office in Helena, a city 90 miles from the property. The seller didn't show up in person, represented only by a power of attorney signed by someone named Richard Patterson. The lawyer who conducted the transaction seemed more like a bored civil servant than an experienced legal professional. He pushed the documents across the desk, pointed where to sign, collected Robert's check for $17,500, and finished everything in less than 20 minutes. No conversation, no explanation, no legal advice. Robert moved onto the property 2 weeks later, bringing only what fit in his worn Ford pickup truck. The first few months were exactly what he expected: peace, silence, the opportunity to rebuild his life away from chaos. He spent his days cutting firewood, making small repairs to the cabin, exploring his land. Evenings were dedicated to reading by oil lamplight and planning future improvements. He wanted to install solar panels, build a greenhouse, maybe raise some chickens. It was a simple life, but it was his life, earned through honest work and careful saving. The nearest neighbors lived almost 5 miles away, a farming family called Thompson. Robert met them for the first time when he went to the nearest small town, Whitehall, to buy supplies. Martha Thompson, a woman in her early 60s with sharp eyes and a reserved smile, worked at the local market. When Robert mentioned where he was living, her expression changed instantly. She exchanged glances with the butcher before carefully asking if he knew about the place's history. Robert said no, and Martha simply nodded, muttering something about letting the past stay buried. That strange conversation stuck with Robert, but he tried not to think too much about it. Every rural community had its local stories and superstitions. Maybe someone had died on the property years ago. Maybe there were rumors of paranormal activity. Country folks tended to be superstitious about these things. But when he started noticing other strange signs, the conversation with Martha Thompson gained new meaning. There were fresh tire tracks on the access road to the property, despite Robert not having any visitors. One night, he saw lights flashing in the distant forest, moving too organized to be campers' flashlights. The incident that finally led him to dig happened 3 weeks before discovering the bunker. Robert was lying in bed when he heard a distinctive sound coming from beneath the wooden floor. Running water, but not in the pipes he knew about. It was a different sound, deeper, more distant. He spent the next day investigating, knocking on the floor at different points, trying to locate the source of the sound. During one attempt, a floorboard gave slightly under his weight, revealing that the soil below wasn't natural but seemed to have been excavated and backfilled at some point. That's when he decided to dig where he planned to install the septic tank, strategically choosing a location his investigation suggested was above the disturbed area. He figured maybe there was an old drainage system or an abandoned cistern. Never in his wildest dreams did he imagine he'd find a classified military installation buried beneath his humble cabin. Now, sitting at the kitchen table that first night after the discovery, Robert faced the most important question. What the hell was a secret Cold War military base doing buried on private property in the middle of nowhere in Montana? Robert spent a sleepless night researching Cold War bunkers on his laptop. The weak internet connection from his satellite dish loading pages frustratingly slowly. What he discovered both fascinated and terrified him. Between 1958 and 1965, the United States government had built hundreds of secret facilities across the country as part of the Continuity of Government program. These weren't just bomb shelters. They were command centers, communication hubs, supply depots, and fallout refuges designed to keep the government functioning even after nuclear war. Many had been decommissioned and sealed in the 70s and 80s, but their exact locations remained classified. Some had been sold to private parties through front companies, their true nature hidden beneath layers of paperwork and bureaucratic obfuscation. The implications hit Robert like a freight train. His cabin wasn't built on top of a bunker by coincidence. The cabin was probably constructed specifically to hide and guard the entrance. The suspiciously low price, the quick sales, the fake-sounding owner names, it all made sense now. This property had likely been maintained by government contractors or intelligence operatives posing as regular owners, keeping the site secure and secret for decades. But something had changed recently. Someone had decided it was safe enough to sell to a genuine civilian, or perhaps they'd simply run out of funding to maintain the cover. Either way, Robert now owned something the government probably didn't want him to know about. By dawn, Robert had made his decision. He would open that door. Whatever was down there had been sitting undisturbed for probably 30 or 40 years. The Cold War was over, the Soviet Union had collapsed, and most of these facilities had been forgotten or deliberately abandoned. If the government still cared about this bunker, they would have seized the property long ago or at least maintained better control over the sales. The fact that it had ended up in his hands suggested it had fallen through bureaucratic cracks. He would document everything carefully, take photos, and only then decide whether to involve authorities. Robert spent the morning gathering supplies, powerful LED flashlights, spare batteries, his digital camera, a crowbar, WD-40 lubricant, work gloves, and a rope in case he needed to climb. He also wrote a detailed note explaining what he'd found and where he was going, sealing it in an envelope addressed to Martha Thompson. If something happened to him down there, a collapse, toxic gas, booby traps, at least someone would know where to look. He placed the envelope prominently on his kitchen table, grabbed his supplies, and headed back to the excavation site. In the daylight, the bunker entrance looked even more imposing. Robert had cleared away most of the dirt overnight in his excitement, revealing the full extent of the door and its frame. The steel had weathered remarkably well, protected by thick coatings of military-grade paint and sealant. The locking mechanism was a wheel-style handle, similar to what you'd see on a submarine or bank vault, with 6 heavy bolts that secured the door to the frame. Robert sprayed WD-40 liberally on all the moving parts and the hinges, letting the penetrating oil work its magic while he cleared away the last of the debris. 30 minutes later, he gripped the wheel with both hands and pulled. Nothing. He tried pushing. Still nothing. The mechanism hadn't moved in decades and was thoroughly seized. Robert repositioned himself, braced his feet against the concrete frame, and pulled with everything he had. Something groaned deep in the metal. Encouraged, he worked the wheel back and forth, slowly, patiently, spraying more lubricant whenever resistance increased. After 20 grueling minutes, the wheel suddenly rotated a full turn, then another. The bolts were retracting. With a sound like a giant's sigh, the door broke its seal. Decades-old air rushed out carrying the smell of concrete, metal, and something else, something chemical and preserved. Robert's flashlight beam cut through the darkness beyond, revealing a steep metal staircase descending at a 45-degree angle into blackness. The walls were painted institutional green, now faded and peeling in places. Pipes and electrical conduits ran along the ceiling, disappearing into the depths. At the bottom of the visible stairs, perhaps 30 feet down, the passage turned sharply to the right. Robert's hands shook as he took his first photograph. The flash illuminated details his flashlight had missed, stenciled warnings on the walls reading "Authorized personnel only" and "Security clearance required," a faded radiation trefoil symbol, and, most chillingly, a sign that read CB7 Site Omega, Operational Capacity. 24 personnel, 90 days. This wasn't just a simple shelter. This was a fully operational bunker designed to house 24 people for 3 months without surface contact. Robert did the math. With proper supplies, this facility could have served as a command post, a communications relay, or even a missile control center during the nuclear war. He secured the rope to a nearby tree, creating a safety line back to the surface. Taking a deep breath of fresh air, Robert descended. Each step echoed in the confined space, the metal stairs solid despite their age. The temperature dropped noticeably as he went deeper, from the crisp 50-degree November air above to a constant 55 degrees underground. The walls were sweating slightly, condensation from the temperature differential, but showed no signs of major water intrusion. The construction quality was impressive. This bunker had been built to last. At the bottom of the stairs, Robert found himself in a junction room. 3 corridors branched off in different directions, each marked with faded signage. To the left, Communications, Restricted. Straight ahead, Living Quarters, Mess Hall. To the right, Command Center, Top Secret. His flashlight swept across the floor, revealing a thin layer of dust undisturbed except by his own footprints. No one had been down here in a very, very long time. The air tasted stale but breathable. Somewhere in this complex, ventilation shafts must still be drawing fresh air from the surface, probably hidden among the rocks and trees above. Robert chose the left corridor first, moving slowly and carefully. His flashlight beam revealed a passage about 6 feet wide and 7 feet tall, with thick concrete walls and a rubberized floor that absorbed sound. Every 20 feet there were heavy doors on both sides, each marked with room numbers and function labels. The first door he tried was unlocked, swinging open with surprising ease. Inside was a small room, perhaps 10 feet by 10 feet, containing metal shelves stacked with equipment he didn't immediately recognize. Radios, maybe, or some kind of electronic gear, all covered in dust and looking decidedly vintage with their analog dials and vacuum tubes. He moved to the communications room at the end of the corridor. This space was larger, maybe 20 feet by 30 feet, and filled with equipment that would have been cutting edge in the early 60s. There were multiple radio transceivers, a teletype machine, banks of switches and indicator lights, and, most impressively, a massive shortwave antenna controller connected to cables that presumably ran up through the mountain to hidden antennas on the surface. Everything was powered down, dormant, waiting. Robert photographed it all, the flash creating stark shadows in the underground chamber. This equipment, if restored, might be worth thousands to military collectors and Cold War museums. But it was what he found in the filing cabinets that made his pulse quicken. The drawers were unlocked. Why secure them when the entire facility was supposed to be secret? And filled with documents. Robert pulled out a folder at random and opened it under his flashlight. His eyes widened. These weren't just operational manuals or maintenance logs. These were contingency plans, target lists, and communication protocols for nuclear war scenarios. One document, dated October 1962, right in the middle of the Cuban Missile Crisis, detailed evacuation procedures for state government officials and the chain of command for Montana in the event of Soviet attack. If you're enjoying this discovery, hit the like button and subscribe so you don't miss our next find. The secrets Robert is uncovering get even more incredible from here, and you won't want to miss what he finds in the command center. Robert carefully placed several key documents in his backpack. These were historical artifacts now, not active classified materials. The Cold War had ended over 30 years ago, the Soviet Union had dissolved, and most of these contingency plans had been declassified or were at least no longer operationally sensitive. Still, he felt like he was stealing state secrets as he zipped up his pack. He moved back through the corridor to the junction room and this time headed straight toward the living quarters. The mess hall was exactly what he expected. Long metal tables with attached bench seats, an institutional kitchen with massive pots and pans still hanging on wall hooks, and storage areas that once held enough canned and dried food to feed 24 people for 90 days. Most of the food was long gone, either removed during decommissioning or spoiled beyond recognition, but he found some intact cans in a back corner, peaches, green beans, and Spam, all with expiration dates from 1963 and 1964. The labels were faded but readable, vintage packaging that collectors would probably pay good money for. The sleeping quarters consisted of 12 small rooms, each containing 2 bunk beds with thin mattresses that had deteriorated into lumps of foam and fabric. Small metal lockers stood at the foot of each bed. Robert opened several and found personal effects left behind. Old magazines from the early 60s, playing cards, a harmonica, photographs of families, even some letters. These small human touches made the bunker feel less like a military installation and more like a time capsule. Real people had lived here during alert periods, sitting underground for weeks at a time, waiting for a nuclear war that thankfully never came. The bathroom facilities were communal and Spartan. A row of sinks, several toilet stalls, and a large shower room with multiple heads. Everything was military spec, built for functionality over comfort. Interestingly, the plumbing still seemed intact. When Robert experimentally turned one of the sink faucets, it groaned and sputtered, then produced a stream of rusty brown water that slowly cleared. There was still water pressure down here, which meant the underground well and pump system were still operational after all these years. That was remarkable engineering. He saved the command center for last, approaching the heavy steel door marked with faded, top-secret stencils. His hand hesitated on the handle. This was the heart of the facility, where decisions would have been made, where orders would have been given, where the unthinkable would have been set in motion if war had come. Robert pushed the door open and stepped inside, his flashlight beam sweeping across a room that took his breath away. The command center was the largest space in the bunker, at least 40 feet long and 30 feet wide, with a low ceiling covered in acoustic tiles. The front wall was dominated by a massive map of North America, marked with hundreds of pins and markers that indicated missile sites, military bases, cities, and Soviet target probabilities. Below the map was a long desk with multiple communication stations, each with its own telephone, radio handset, and status board. Behind that were plotting tables with clear plastic overlays and grease pencils still lying where they'd been abandoned. On the right side of the room stood the most ominous piece of equipment, a metal safe, about 4 feet tall and 3 feet wide, with a combination lock and a warning label that read, "Authorized use only. Authentication required." Robert approached the safe slowly. Unlike everything else in the bunker, this safe showed signs of attempted entry. The combination dial was damaged, and there were scratches around the door frame suggesting someone had tried to pry it open. But the safe had held. Whatever was inside had been considered important enough to seal behind military-grade security. Robert pulled on the handle experimentally, not expecting anything. To his shock, the handle moved. The safe wasn't fully locked. The damage to the dial had compromised the locking mechanism. With steady pressure, the heavy door swung open, revealing the contents that would change everything Robert thought he knew about his property and its value. Inside the safe, Robert's flashlight revealed stacks of sealed metal boxes, each about the size of a large shoebox, marked with serial numbers and classification stamps. His hands trembled as he pulled out the first box. It was surprisingly heavy, maybe 10 pounds, and sealed with a combination of metal clasps and what looked like wax seals that had cracked with age. The label read, "Emergency Protocol Alpha, Authentication Codes, valid until 31st, Dec 1965. Robert carefully broke the seal and opened the box. Inside were laminated cards, documents in sealed plastic envelopes, and something that made his blood run cold. A set of keys attached to a metal tag reading ICBM Launch Authorization, Site Omega. This wasn't just a communications bunker or a government shelter. This was a missile command facility. Somewhere in these Montana mountains, or perhaps once upon a time, there had been nuclear missiles under the control of this very bunker. Robert's mind reeled at the implications. The government hadn't just forgotten about this place. They'd deliberately obscured its existence, buried its history under layers of classified documents and fake property transfers. The bunker had probably been decommissioned when newer, more sophisticated command systems came online in the late 60s or early 70s. But the physical evidence of its purpose remained, locked in this safe, waiting for decades. He set the first box aside and examined the others. There were 6 boxes in total, each containing similar materials: authentication codes, communication protocols, targeting data, and authorization keys. But it was the 7th item in the safe that caught his attention. A heavy canvas bag, olive drab with U.S. Army stenciled on the side. Robert lifted it out carefully. It clinked with a metallic sound. He loosened the drawstring and poured some of the contents into his palm. Gold coins, American gold eagles, Canadian maple leafs, and South African Krugerrands, each one gleaming despite decades in darkness. There were also silver bars, each stamped with government markings and weight specifications. Robert's heart hammered in his chest. This was emergency currency, the kind of tangible wealth that would still have value even if the banking system collapsed after nuclear war. Every bunker would have had some, but this seemed like more than a standard allocation. He counted quickly. At least 200 gold coins of various weights, plus 20 silver bars of 10 ounces each. At current market prices, gold around $2,000 per ounce, silver around $25 per ounce. He was holding somewhere between $400,000 and $500,000 in precious metals, and that was just in one bag. There were 3 more canvas bags in the safe. Robert checked each one, his disbelief growing with each discovery. The second bag contained more gold and silver, roughly equal to the first. The third bag held currency, not modern bills, but older notes from the 50s and 60s, bundled in stacks of hundreds. Most were $20 bills and 50s, thousands upon thousands of dollars in vintage currency. Collectors paid premiums for bills in good condition from that era, sometimes double or triple face value. The fourth bag contained something unexpected: diamond stones in small sealed bags, each labeled with weight and quality ratings. Industrial diamonds probably meant for trade or reconstruction after war, but still valuable. Robert sat down hard on the concrete floor, his legs suddenly weak. The total value of what he just found was staggering. Conservative estimate, somewhere between $800,000 and $1 million, possibly more depending on the authentication and historical value of the documents, the condition of the vintage currency, and the actual gold content of the coins. This wasn't just a fascinating historical discovery anymore. This was life-changing wealth, the kind of money that could transform his entire existence, pay off any debt, fund any dream. But it also came with massive complications and potential legal nightmares. Who legally owned this wealth? Robert owned the property, and everything on it should technically be his according to property law. But these were government assets, placed here by military authorities during the Cold War. Even if the bunker had been abandoned and forgotten, did the government still have claim to its contents? There were legal precedents both ways. Some people who'd bought decommissioned military property had been allowed to keep everything they found. Others had been forced to surrender items deemed to be government property. The difference often came down to how items were classified and whether they'd been formally transferred or simply forgotten. Robert made a decision. He would remove everything from the bunker and hide it on his property, giving himself time to research his legal options and consult with attorneys. If the government had wanted to secure these assets, they'd had 50 years to do so. The fact that they'd sold the property multiple times through front companies, eventually letting it reach the open market, suggested they'd either lost track of it completely or decided it wasn't worth maintaining. Either way, Robert wasn't going to volunteer information about his discovery until he understood his rights and options. Finders keepers might not be sophisticated legal doctrine, but possession was 9/10 of the law. He spent the next 4 hours systematically transporting everything valuable from the safe to the surface. The bags of precious metals were heaviest, requiring multiple trips and leaving his arms aching. The document boxes were lighter but more awkward, requiring careful handling to avoid damaging the historical materials inside. He worked steadily, methodically, stopping frequently to listen for any sounds of approaching vehicles or people. The isolation that had seemed lonely now felt like a blessing. No one was around to see him hauling mysterious bags and boxes from a hole in his yard. By late afternoon, everything was transferred to his cabin. Robert stacked it all in his bedroom closet, covering everything with old blankets and clothes to hide it from casual view. He then returned to the bunker one last time, taking more photographs and exploring the areas he'd initially skipped. There were mechanical rooms with generators and fuel tanks, all long since drained. There was a medical bay with vintage first aid supplies and radiation treatment equipment. There was even a small armory, though the weapons had been removed. Only empty racks and ammunition lockers remained, their contents presumably taken during decommissioning. Robert spent the next week in a state of anxious paralysis. The bags of gold and silver sat in his closet like bombs waiting to explode. Every car that passed on the distant highway made his pulse quicken. Every plane flying overhead seemed to be circling his property. He knew he was being paranoid, but the magnitude of his discovery had shaken his sense of security. He'd gone from being a simple man seeking a quiet rural life to being the unwitting custodian of classified military secrets and potentially $1 million in government assets. The weight of it was crushing. He started researching obsessively, using his laptop to dig through legal cases, government databases, and military history forums. What he learned was both encouraging and terrifying. There had been dozens of similar cases over the years. People who bought surplus government property and found items left behind. Some cases had ended well for the finders. A man in Oklahoma discovered a cache of vintage military equipment in a bunker on his property and successfully auctioned it for $200,000. A woman in Washington state found gold coins in a decommissioned Army base she'd purchased and kept them after a brief legal challenge. But other cases had ended badly. A couple in Arizona found what they thought was abandoned government equipment and were prosecuted for possession of stolen government property. The key distinction seemed to be whether items were abandoned or merely forgotten. Abandoned property, legally speaking, was a property the government had deliberately relinquished all claim to. Forgotten property was still technically government-owned, even if no one was actively tracking it. The problem was determining which category Robert's discovery fell into. The bunker had clearly been decommissioned. The weapons were removed, the facility was sealed, the property was sold. That suggested abandonment. But the classification stamps on the documents and the government markings on the precious metals argued for continuing government ownership regardless of physical location. Robert needed legal advice, but consulting a lawyer meant revealing what he'd found, and revealing what he'd found meant potentially losing it all. He was trapped in a catch-22 situation. After days of agonizing deliberation, he decided on a middle path. He would consult with an attorney, but not locally. He'd drive to Billings, 200 miles away, and meet with a lawyer who specialized in property law and government surplus issues. He'd present the situation hypothetically at first, feeling out the attorney's perspective before revealing his identity or exact location. It was risky, but less risky than either keeping silent or going directly to authorities. The drive to Billings took 4 hours through winding mountain roads and high plains. Robert had put the most valuable items, the gold coins, in a locked toolbox hidden under a tarp in his truck bed, not willing to leave them unguarded at the cabin. The rest remained hidden in his closet. He'd set up a simple security system. Fishing lines stretched across the driveway at ankle height, attached to bells inside the cabin. Anyone approaching while he was gone would trigger the alert. It was primitive, but the isolation of his property meant any visitor would have to come down the single-access road. The law office of Patricia Hendricks was in a modest building near downtown Billings. Hendricks herself was in her mid-50s, with sharp eyes and a reputation for handling unusual property disputes. Robert had found her through careful online research. She'd successfully represented clients in 3 different cases involving military surplus property. Her initial consultation fee was $250 for 1 hour. Robert paid in cash, using old bills from his savings, not wanting any electronic trail connecting him to this visit. "Mr. Caldwell," Hendricks said, shaking his hand and gesturing to a leather chair across from her desk, "your phone call was intriguing. You said you had questions about government property found on private land." Her tone was professional but curious. Robert nodded, settling into the chair and choosing his words carefully. He explained the situation as a hypothetical. Suppose someone bought rural property and discovered a decommissioned military bunker containing documents and valuable materials. What were the legal obligations? What were the ownership rights? Could the finder keep what they found, or would the government seize it? Hendricks listened intently, taking notes on a legal pad. When Robert finished, she leaned back in her chair and steepled her fingers thoughtfully. "This isn't actually hypothetical, is it, Mr. Caldwell?" Robert hesitated, then shook his head. Hendricks smiled slightly. "I appreciate your caution, but I need the full story to give you proper advice. Attorney-client privilege protects everything you tell me. I can't reveal your secrets without your permission, even if subpoenaed in most circumstances." She paused, letting that sink in. "So, tell me, what exactly did you find, and where?" Robert took a deep breath and told her everything. The purchase of the property, the discovery of the bunker, the exploration of the facility, and finally, the contents of the safe. He described the documents, the authentication codes, the launch authorization keys, and most importantly, the bags of gold, silver, currency, and diamonds. Hendricks' expression remained professionally neutral throughout, but her eyes widened slightly when he mentioned the precious metals. When he finished, she was silent for a long moment, processing the information. "Mr. Caldwell," she finally said, "you've stumbled into an extremely complicated legal situation. The good news is that you probably have a legitimate claim to most or all of what you found. The property was legally sold to you, and there's no indication in your deed of any government reservations or retained rights. The bunker and its contents were on the property, making them legally yours under the principle of fixtures and chattels. The bad news is that the government, if they learn about this, will almost certainly challenge your ownership. They'll argue the materials were government property never legally transferred, still classified and subject to government control." She flipped through her notes, her pen tapping against the paper rhythmically. "Here's my advice, and understand this is risky either way. You have 3 options. Option 1. Voluntarily report the discovery to the government, likely through the Department of Defense or the General Services Administration. They'll take custody of everything while ownership is determined. You might eventually get some of it back, or you might get nothing. Option 2. Keep quiet and hope no one ever finds out. This is technically illegal if the materials are still government property, but practically speaking, if the bunker was forgotten and abandoned, you'll probably never face consequences. Option 3. File a quiet title action, essentially asking a court to confirm your ownership before the government becomes aware. This is the most legally sound approach, but it alerts the government to the situation and starts a potentially expensive legal battle. Robert felt his stomach sink. None of those options were good. Option 1 meant almost certainly losing everything he'd found. Option 2 meant living in constant fear of discovery and prosecution. Option 3 meant expensive litigation with uncertain outcome. Hendricks saw his expression and softened slightly. "There is a 4th option," she said quietly. "Sell what you can discreetly, convert it to cash or other assets, and never mention the bunker to anyone. The documents and military items are too hot to sell. They'd attract attention immediately. But precious metals are effectively anonymous if sold carefully. You could liquidate the gold and silver through private dealers claiming it was inherited or found through metal detecting. No one tracks those sales aggressively. The vintage currency could be sold through online auctions to collectors. The diamonds could be sold internationally. Within 6 months, you could have converted everything to clean, untraceable wealth." Robert drove back to his cabin in silence, his mind churning through the options Patricia Hendricks had presented. The 4th option, the illegal one, kept circling back to the front of his thoughts. It was morally ambiguous at best, potentially criminal at worst, but it was also the most practical solution. The government had abandoned this facility decades ago, sold the property multiple times, and never once indicated any interest in recovering what was left behind. They'd had 50 years to maintain control and had chosen not to. In Robert's mind, that constituted abandonment, even if the law might see it differently. By the time he pulled into his driveway just after dark, he'd made his decision. He would liquidate the precious metals and currency quietly, keep the historical documents as insurance, and never speak of the bunker to anyone outside his attorney. The next morning, Robert began his research into precious metals dealers. He quickly learned that selling large quantities of gold and silver required careful planning. Dealers were required to report transactions over $10,000 to the IRS, and multiple smaller transactions to the same dealer would raise red flags. The solution was to spread his sales across multiple dealers in different cities, keeping each transaction under the reporting threshold. It would take time, months probably, but it would avoid creating a suspicious paper trail. He made a list of dealers in Montana, Wyoming, Idaho, and North Dakota, planning a circuit that would look like normal travel rather than a deliberate sales campaign. His first stop was a gold dealer in Great Falls, a city about 150 miles north of his property. Robert brought 20 gold coins, a mix of American eagles and Canadian maple leafs, carefully selected to represent a plausible small collection someone might have inherited or accumulated over time. The dealer, a heavyset man named Frank with suspicious eyes and rough hands, examined each coin under magnification, tested them with an electronic analyzer, and weighed them precisely. "Nice pieces," Frank said, his tone neutral. "Where'd you get these?" Robert had his story prepared. Inherited from an uncle who'd been a collector, decided to sell because he needed cash for property improvements. Frank nodded, neither believing nor disbelieving, just acknowledging the explanation. The transaction took 15 minutes. Frank offered 95% of spot price for the gold, explaining his markup covered overhead and profit. Robert had researched enough to know this was standard, even slightly generous. 20 coins at roughly 1 ounce each, gold at $2,000 per ounce, 95% of spot, $38,000. Frank counted out the cash in hundreds, making Robert sign a receipt that documented the transaction for Frank's records but stayed under IRS reporting thresholds. Robert walked out with a thick envelope of bills, his heart pounding with a mixture of exhilaration and guilt. He'd just made more in 15 minutes than he used to make in 6 months as a mechanic. Over the next 3 months, Robert repeated this process systematically. He drove to Billings and sold silver bars to a dealer who specialized in bulk precious metals. He went to Bozeman and sold gold coins to a dealer who asked fewer questions than Frank had. He crossed into Wyoming and sold more gold in Sheridan and Gillette. He even made a trip to Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, selling to a dealer who operated from a fortified shop that looked like it expected the apocalypse. Each transaction followed the same pattern: small enough to avoid reporting, plausible enough to avoid suspicion, cash payment, minimal paperwork. By early February, Robert had converted roughly $400,000 in precious metals to cash. The vintage currency proved more challenging but potentially more profitable. Robert photographed the bills, taking care not to show too many at once, and listed them on numismatic auction sites under various seller accounts. Collectors bid aggressively on bills from the 50s and 60s in good condition, especially sequential serial numbers or rare printing variations. A stack of $50 bills from 1958 sold for 3 times face value. A series of $20 bills with star notes, rare replacement bills, brought even more. Robert was patient, selling small lots weekly, spreading transactions across multiple platforms. By March, he'd sold about half the vintage currency for roughly $120,000, with more auctions still running. The diamonds were the most difficult to liquidate. Robert had no expertise in gemstones and didn't trust himself to negotiate with dealers who might recognize his ignorance and lowball him. Instead, he reached out to Patricia Hendricks again, asking if she knew anyone who could authenticate and broker diamond sales discreetly. Hendricks connected him with a jeweler in Seattle who specialized in estate sales and asked minimal questions. Robert shipped the stones via insured courier. Risky, but less risky than carrying them across state lines himself. The jeweler's assessment came back 2 weeks later, mostly industrial-grade diamonds but a few gem-quality stones in the mix. Total value approximately $60,000. The jeweler offered $50,000 cash, a fair price for a discreet transaction. Robert accepted. By spring, Robert had accumulated over $570,000 in cash, stored in waterproof bags buried at various locations around his property. He'd also deposited money gradually into 3 different bank accounts at 3 different banks, never more than $9,000 at a time to avoid triggering reporting requirements. He opened a legitimate business, Caldwell Property Management, to explain increasing deposits as income from consulting work. The paper trail wouldn't withstand serious IRS scrutiny, but it was plausible enough for normal banking purposes. Robert had transformed himself from a diesel mechanic living on savings to a man of considerable wealth, all while maintaining his simple lifestyle in the Montana cabin. But the documents and military equipment remained in his possession, hidden in the bunker and his cabin. These items were too historically significant and too obviously government property to sell safely. Robert had considered destroying them, burning the papers, disassembling and scrapping the equipment, but he couldn't bring himself to do it. These were pieces of history, evidence of a secret program most Americans didn't know existed. They deserved preservation, even if that preservation had to remain secret for now. He photographed everything extensively, storing digital copies on encrypted drives he kept in a safe deposit box in Billings under his business name. The bunker itself became Robert's secret project. Now that he'd removed the most valuable and incriminating items, he began restoring it as a functional space. He cleaned the rooms, tested the electrical systems, even got the generator running on fresh diesel fuel. The communications equipment was too antiquated to be useful, but he left it in place as historical artifacts. He brought down comfortable furniture, modern LED lighting, and supplies. The bunker became a refuge within a refuge, a place he could retreat to that absolutely no one else knew about. In a world of surveillance and connectivity, Robert had found perhaps the last truly private space in America. Robert's new life of quiet prosperity lasted exactly 7 months before the past caught up with him. It was a Tuesday in late June when the black SUV appeared at the end of his driveway. Robert was splitting firewood behind the cabin when he noticed it. A Chevrolet Suburban with government plates, tinted windows, and 2 men in dark suits climbing out. His blood turned to ice. This was the moment he'd been dreading since that November day when his shovel first struck the bunker door. Somehow, someone had found out. He set down the axe slowly, wiped his hands on his jeans, and walked around to the front of the cabin to meet them. "Robert Caldwell?" the first man asked. He was in his 40s, fit, with short gray hair and eyes that had seen too much. His suit was expensive but practical, and he carried himself with the confidence of someone who'd been in dangerous situations and survived. The second man was younger, maybe 30, with a tablet computer in his hands and the alert posture of someone ready for trouble. "I'm Agent Marcus Webb, Defense Intelligence Agency. This is Agent Chen. We need to talk to you about your property and some items that may be located here. May we come inside?" Robert's mind raced. Deny everything? Demand a warrant? Call Patricia Hendricks. But something in Webb's tone wasn't aggressive. It was almost resigned, like a man performing an unpleasant duty he couldn't avoid. Robert made a calculated decision to cooperate, at least partially. "I'd like to know what this is about first," he said calmly. "Am I being accused of something?" Webb shook his head. "Not at this time. We're conducting an inventory of certain Cold War-era facilities. Our records indicate there may be a decommissioned structure on this property. We'd like to inspect it and verify that certain materials have been properly secured or removed." So they knew about the bunker, but how much did they know about what he'd found and removed? Robert decided to play it carefully. "There is a structure," he admitted. "I discovered it last year while doing excavation work. It's an old bunker or something, from the 60s by the look of it. I explored it, it's my property after all, but I didn't remove anything sensitive. Just looked around and took some photos." It was a partial truth, the kind that might hold up under questioning. Webb nodded slowly. "We'd like to see it, and we'd like to see any photographs or materials you may have taken from the facility." Robert led them to the bunker entrance, now permanently exposed with the tarp removed. He'd cleaned up the excavation site, making it look more like a deliberate feature of the property than a hasty discovery. Webb and Chen descended the stairs with flashlights, and Robert followed, his heart hammering. The bunker looked different than when he'd first discovered it. Cleaner, more organized, with his furniture and supplies visible in some rooms. Webb walked through slowly, methodically, checking each space. When they reached the command center, Webb stopped in front of the safe, now empty and standing open. He stared at it for a long moment before turning to Robert. "The contents of this safe. Where are they?" Robert had prepared for this question. "Empty when I found it," he lied. "Door was damaged and standing open. If there was anything valuable in there, it was removed long before I bought the property." Webb's expression was unreadable. He turned to Chen. Check the inventory records, what was supposed to be in CB7's primary secure storage. Chen tapped on his tablet for a moment, then shook his head. Records are incomplete, sir. Site was decommissioned in 1971. Final inventory was never properly filed, or, if it was, it didn't make it into the digital archives. There's a note saying certain items were transferred to Site Kilo, but no specific manifest. Webb sighed, and for the first time, Robert saw something like relief cross his face. "Mr. Caldwell," Webb said carefully, "I'm going to be straight with you because I think you deserve honesty. The DIA didn't know this site still existed until 3 months ago. It fell through the cracks during Cold War drawdown. Someone should have demolished this bunker in the 70s, or at minimum, secured it properly. Instead, it got sold off through a cover company that eventually dissolved, and the property entered private ownership. We only found out about it because a researcher was digitizing old records and cross-referenced this location with current land ownership databases. That's when your name popped up." Robert's mind was spinning. 3 months ago. That was March, right around when he'd started selling the vintage currency online. Had someone traced those bills? Had a coin dealer reported him? But Webb continued, seemingly unaware of Robert's internal panic. "The truth is, Mr. Caldwell, this is embarrassing for us. This bunker shouldn't exist anymore, and you shouldn't have been able to buy it without being told what was here. The correct procedure would have been to seize the property, compensate you for the purchase price, and demolish the bunker. But my superiors have decided that would create more problems than it solves. It would require explanations, congressional inquiries, media attention, none of which anyone wants." Webb moved closer and his voice dropped to a more confidential tone. "So here's what's going to happen. You're going to sign a non-disclosure agreement stating you will never discuss this facility, its location, or its purpose with anyone. In exchange, the government will formally transfer ownership of the bunker and all remaining contents to you. We'll file paperwork indicating the site was properly decommissioned and all sensitive materials were removed in 1971. You get to keep your property, we get to close an embarrassing file, and everyone moves on. The only condition is that if you ever try to sell this property, you must notify us first so we can ensure the bunker is properly sealed or demolished before new owners take possession." Robert could hardly believe what he was hearing. They were offering him exactly what he wanted: legal ownership and official closure, in exchange for silence. No questions about the safe's contents, no inventory verification, no forensic accounting of what might have been removed. The government was so eager to bury this mistake that they were willing to let it all go. He tried to keep his voice steady. "And if I refuse to sign?" Webb smiled thinly. "Then we do this the hard way. We seize the property under eminent domain. You spend years in court fighting for compensation, and the story probably leaks to the press. You become the guy who found a secret government bunker, which sounds exciting until reporters are camped on your lawn and conspiracy theorists are calling you at 3 in the morning. Trust me, you want the quiet option." Before we wrap up Robert's incredible story, we want to hear from you. What would you do with this kind of life-changing discovery? Would you have reported it immediately, or done what Robert did? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, and ring that notification bell so you don't miss our next incredible discovery. We've got more amazing stories of people who found the unexpected waiting for you. Robert signed the non-disclosure agreement 2 days later in Patricia Hendrick's office, with Webb and Chen present as witnesses. The document was surprisingly simple. A few pages stating he would never publicly discuss Site CB7 or any information related to it, in exchange for clear title to the property and immunity from any claims regarding items that may or may not have been present during discovery. Hendricks reviewed every word carefully before advising Robert to sign. "This is as good as you're going to get," she said quietly. "They're giving you a gift, whether they realize it or not. Take it." So Robert signed, and just like that, the most stressful period of his life ended with bureaucratic finality. The aftermath was anticlimactic. Webb and Chen packed up their files and left. Robert received official documentation a week later, a quitclaim deed amendment formally transferring all structures and improvements to his ownership, and a letter from the Department of Defense stating that Site CB7 had been properly decommissioned and cleared of all sensitive materials in 1971. The letter was backdated, a paper fiction to cover the government's embarrassment. Robert filed it with his property records and moved on. The bunker remained his secret refuge, known only to him and the two agents who had every reason to forget it existed. Robert never sold any more of the items from the bunker. He had enough money now to live comfortably for the rest of his life, especially with his simple lifestyle and minimal expenses. The remaining vintage currency went into a safe deposit box, an emergency fund if he ever needed it. The documents and photographs stayed hidden, historical artifacts he kept as insurance and remembrance. He occasionally went down into the bunker, sat in the command center, and thought about the men who'd worked there during the tensest days of the Cold War. They'd been preparing for a war that never came, guarding weapons that were never fired, waiting for orders that never arrived. In a way, Robert was now the guardian of their memory, the keeper of secrets that the world had moved on from. Life returned to normal, or as normal as life could be, for a man sitting on $500,000 in cash and a secret government bunker. Robert made improvements to his cabin, bought new equipment, even started a small business doing consulting work for other people seeking off-grid lifestyles. He was careful with his money, never spending conspicuously, always maintaining the appearance of a simple mechanic living a simple life. And he never forgot the lesson he'd learned, that sometimes the most valuable discoveries are the ones you keep to yourself, that silence can be more powerful than revelation, and that the past, when properly buried, stays buried.